Well, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Scott Dawson. I'm Dean here in the Business School at CU Denver. In my work, and I bet the case is the same for you, almost every day, multiple times a day, I have conversations with people in the business community on campus about what the future of the workplace looks like and how to design workplaces for maximizing satisfaction, worker satisfaction, productivity, and the like. And it seems like we live in a time of just one quite grand experiment. And we're really fortunate today to have three really excellent panelists to address that question. Before I introduce them, though, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and can be accessed at a later date. And we have a number of questions that we're going to have the panel address, but there will be time for addressing questions from you, the audience, towards the end. So please do put your questions in the Q&A function rather than the chat function, and we'll get to those towards the end. And as I sit here in downtown Denver, just want to honor and appreciate the lands of the peoples that we inhabit, particularly the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. So we have three great panelists today. Joining us from Boston is Julie Whelan. She's the Global Head of Occupier Thought Leadership at CBRE. She leads a global team of researchers tasked with identifying major trends impacting commercial real estate occupiers across all industries. Julie also works directly with CBR professionals across the advisory and transaction services business to advise clients on real estate markets and strategies around the world. An expert on the future of work, Julie is particularly interested in how the fundamental shifts towards sustainability and flexibility are reshaping the strategy and utilization of space. Julie earned a bachelor's degree from Providence College and a master's in business administration from Suffolk. Joining us from just outside of New York City is Laurent Boussard. He's the Chief Financial Officer, BMO Head for Chase Consumer Community Banking Operations and the Head of CCB, Location Strategy at Chase. He's the Chief, as I mentioned, Chief Financial Officer. His prior roles at Chase include Head of Business Management for CCB Tech, President of the Private Label Credit Card Segment, and Head of Business Engineering for Chase Card and then CCB overall. Prior to joining Chase in 2008, Laurent spent 11 years at GE Capital. After several roles as relationship manager to major retailers, Laurent moved into his first business leader role as President of GE Partnership Marketing Group in 2005. And in 2006, he became the CEO of GE WMC Mortgage, which GE exited in 2007. He holds an MBA from MIT. And our third panelist comes to us from the CU Denver Business School. Wayne Cassio is Distinguished Professor Emeritus. He is the former president of the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology and has served as a member of the Academy of Management's Board of Governors. He was awarded an honorary doctorate from the University of Geneva, Switzerland in 2004, the Distinguished Scientific Contributions Award from the Society of Industrial Organizational Psychology in 2013, and in 2016, by a vote of 90 countries, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the World Federation of People Management Associations. In 2020, he was inducted into the Australian HR Institute's Hall of Fame. He has published more than 200 articles and book chapters and 33 books and delivered more than 750 presentations to professional and business audiences worldwide. So fabulous group of individuals we have today to address these really interesting and provocative issues. So to get started, let's just level set here by what we mean by hybrid work. Wayne, you want to tackle that question?
Sure. I asked Michaela to put up a couple of slides. Maybe she can share her screen. Yeah. At a general level, it's just the practice of employees doing their jobs from someplace other than a central office that's operated by an employer. And, just some examples. The most obvious one is work from home. but it could also be a shared space, a co-working space, or a private office, any place other than a traditional corporate office building or campus. And it's based on the idea that work doesn't have to be done in a specific place in order for people to be successful at accomplishing their work. I'd like to show you, Michaela, could you go to the next slide? I'm going to show you some data on the massive shift that we've seen pre and post pandemic. So the next slide, please. This was pre-pandemic. If you look from 2005 to 2019, the maximum, where the majority of work was being done at home, was still under 6% of the workforce. And even in workplaces that had flexible workplace benefits, Flex Place, it hit a maximum of about 7% of the workforce. This is pre-pandemic up through 2019. You can see back in 2005, it was about 3.5%. And Michaela, could you show the next slide, which is during the pandemic? It hit a peak of 42% in the April 2020 lockdowns during the pandemic. And as you can see, it's fluctuated a bit with the Delta wave hitting in 2021, but it's settled out at about a little over 30%. And that's a huge jump from the 6% or 5.5% that we were seeing pre-pandemic. And this has led to massive shifts in where people are accomplishing their work. We hear often that work from home is the new signing bonus for a lot of new workers. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that sets the stage.
Thank you so much, Wayne.
Yeah.
So in our industry, higher education, COVID sped up dramatically the delivery of online education, which was sort of budding and happening anyway. So Julie, from your perspective, what trends preceded COVID and have been sped up by COVID with regard to hybrid work?
Yeah, so to follow on what Wayne was saying, hybrid work is certainly what he described. It's doing work anywhere other than just the physical office. And the way that we have always looked at hybrid work is on a spectrum, right? Where you could have an office first culture, you could have a truly blended culture, or you could have what we're seeing emerging, which is a virtual first culture. And on any of those elements of sort of models of the way that you work, you spend more or less time in the physical office, depending on where you actually sit on that spectrum. Now, we had been talking about this even before the pandemic. Right before the pandemic, we were working on a series of articles that we called Real Estate 2030, the age of responsive real estate. And the idea was that whether you're talking office or retail or industrial or multifamily, real estate was just changing, it was transforming, and that we were in an era of a decade between 2020 and 2030 where we were really going to see a pickup in those shifts. Well, right before we were to release that series of articles, the pandemic hit, and we thought, you know what, let's hold back on the big splash of it, but let's release it kind of slowly into the market. And the headline article in that series was one that I wrote, which was called The Age of the Fluid Workplace. And at the time, I had socialized it a lot around CB because our business model, could really shift based on this fluid workplace. And I wanted to make sure that everybody agreed generally with the concepts in it. And everybody said, sure, absolutely, but that's probably going to be something that really happens slowly as the decade unfolds. And lo and behold, fast forward through the pandemic to just about 2 years later now, and it's all anybody is talking about is this fluid workplace. Now, the reason that we even wrote that article was because a lot of what Wayne was talking about in that Census Bureau data that he showed, we saw a lot of those trends happening. We saw our clients talking to us about more mobile workforces and how to plan for them. And we saw space design starting to shift away from one-to-one ratios of desk to people, away from, majority individual work and more towards desk sharing, what we would call activity-based workplaces. But it was happening very, very slowly, but we saw the undercurrent of the shift really starting to happen. And so what is really interesting is just to really level set against what we saw then and now what we're seeing, which is just there's a lot more recognition and acknowledgement, I would say, that this is going to be the way forward. And action is still a little bit on the sidelines right now. I think that people are making incremental changes to their workplace to solve for what hybrid work might mean. But we have to remember that physical occupancy of offices is still really low right now. Nationally, it's still in that like 30 to 35% range, which means that we are not seeing observable trends of what the steady state will hold. So most are holding back transformational plans until they are able to really witness these observable trends in the workplace and plan for the future.
Thank you for that. And just audience, for your information, there are links to 3 different resources provided by CBRE in the chat that you might find useful. Lauren, do you want to add anything to that in terms of what you were seeing prior to COVID and how it's been sped up?
So, very interestingly, I think what we are seeing is really 2 types of hybrid. One is this notion of you spend some of your time working from home and some of your time working in an office. And you have a second type, which is you have now a population that may work from home permanently while another population is in the office, and how do they function together? And one of the important element is that a lot of the things that we used to take for granted in how people interact now have to be actively designed. I think, as Julie said, it includes how you think about how you use the office, and then it includes on how you use those interactions with Zoom and others. It also creates this notion of how do you make sure to be very inclusive in all your conversations when you have people in the room and people naturally that are remote, which, by the way, we used to do pre-COVID, naturally, especially in large organizations that have multiple locations, but it has become a more acute issue. One very interesting things I've seen over the last 2 years, and people comment, is Zoom was a great equalizer. Everybody has the same real estate in the window on the screen and have gotten used to that. You are going back to a situation where actually you have some members that are maybe in the meeting room together and can have offline conversations, other members are remote, and readjusting to that and readjusting to the fact that you want to be inclusive of everyone during this conversation is one of the many examples of the new behaviors that you have to think about as you go back into a hybrid situation. And the difference is is this notion of new normal, right? You had a notion of parenthesis for 2 years where everybody may do in the best way they could due to things that were outside of our control. Now we are going back into a designed workplace. That is, your employer or your colleagues, your partners are describing how they wish to work. And therefore, this notion of making do is no longer available. It's your new normal. And how do you optimize that new normal, I think, is what the big question of all the leaders are asking right now.
Julie, if I could ask a following question. I was just thinking, I had the great fortune of spending a lot of time in the Valley, and, these great tech, buildings at Facebook and LinkedIn and Google, with them spending millions of dollars feeding their employees and bustling, just really bustling, lots of activity. And there was a calculated decision on their part because there are benefits from creating that environment. So where is that environment in the future? Is it still there? Is it lesser? Or
It is still there, 100%. So we have been very bullish on the office from the beginning of this pandemic, not just because of the business that we're in, but also because of what we know our clients are telling us around what the purpose of the office is. You cannot replace the drive for collaboration and community and culture and innovation purely through Zoom. I am a big proponent of hybrid work. I was before the pandemic. I am a product of it. I generally have a very decentralized team around the globe, and we rarely come together. But I do believe in people coming together to do all the things that you just cannot accomplish outside. Now, when you fast forward to today and you actually look at the data, leasing has increased in 2021 exponentially. When you look at who drove that leasing, we actually just got the numbers in of the top 100 leases that were done in 2021, and technology clients did drive that trend. So clearly they are also bullish on the office, and they also know that the purpose of the office is something that they want to solidify in their culture moving forward. Now, these organizations that have large campuses in like Silicon Valley and the like are obviously do have a lot of resources and capital and commitment tied into these. And that is going to continue, but that doesn't mean that they can't implement flexibility. No matter who we talk to across the board, from the largest technology client to the startup, they know that they are going to be infusing more flexibility into their workforce, creating policies that allow predictability for them so that they understand how their office is going to be used. However, flexibility for their employees so that they feel that they are autonomous and that they can drive their own schedule. What I would say is, in this conversation, what a lot of people forget is that we are in a very good labor market right now. We are in a very good economy right now. And so we know that the number of jobs that are out there that are being filled, which are still being driven by technology, are great, right? That's a lot. That's a lot of new office using jobs that's going to come in. We wholeheartedly believe that the ratio of new office space to office using jobs is probably forever changed. However, what this means is that tech clients may not lease as much space as they used to, but it does not mean that they're going to need greatly less space than they have before. It's just that in that campus, the way that they use it going forward, more people may be ebbing and flowing out of that campus than they ever envisioned to happen before, assuming that talent base is in place around that campus to draw from, which obviously in a Silicon Valley it is.
Yeah, great response. Thank you for that. And Wayne, what's the best way to approach the design of hybrid work?
Well, let's try to build on some of the ideas that Julie was just expressing. Michaela, could you put up a couple of more? Go to the next slide, please. Yeah, I just thought I'd share some data. These were from the Wall Street Journal in late October of last year. And these are preferred working arrangements. And it depends on whether people are currently working from home exclusively. And that's, many of those are tech workers or knowledge workers who are doing that. And about half of them, 49%, would like to continue to work from home exclusively. The remainder the majority of those 45% would like some type of hybrid arrangement. And only 6% want to be exclusively on site. But that's among people who are working from home exclusively. If you go to those look on the right side, those who are working hybrid, some type of hybrid arrangement, 2 days a week, a mix and match, 3 days a week at home and a couple of days in the office, about 70% would like to continue to work in a hybrid manner. About 15%, a little bit more now, want to come in and work exclusively on site, and about 15% want to stay remote fully. And then if we look at people who are at the bottom, currently working on site, but the job could be done from home, 52% of them want to continue to work exclusively on site at the office. And on the left side, on the light blue bar, about 37% want the hybrid arrangement, and only 11 want to work exclusively remotely. So when we think about designing this kind of work, I think it's important to keep in mind, especially we're in such tight labor markets in so many parts of the country. It's important to keep in mind what people are looking for. So Michaela, could you go to the next slide, please? These are some data that just came out a couple of weeks ago, based on a survey of 10,000 knowledge workers by Future Forum. Future Forum is run by Slack Technologies. And one of the things I think Julie mentioned is that things have been evolving from the time the pandemic began to where we are now. And based on where we are now, 95% want to have flexible schedules in their work. And 78% want to be able to flex where they work from, the location flexibility. 3/4 want to choose the days when they work from home instead of the employer saying, you have to be here Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. They want to make the choice. And that will drive a point that we're going to make in a minute about that workers really want autonomy. They really want autonomy. And more importantly, it's important to keep in mind that 72% of those who said they're not happy with their current level of flexibility, whether that's based on schedule or on location where they work, are going to look for another job. And research tells us that, you know, people's intentions to look for another job, especially if they are strong, are a pretty good leading indicator of who will quit, who will leave. What's becoming very popular is agreements among team members about when they will work. I first saw this back in 2012, doing some work at Ernst & Young, now EY, and these were audit teams, and they were setting up team calendars to decide when they would be able to work best at the client's site, at the client's work site. And these kinds of team calendars are suddenly taking off, and we're seeing this in a variety of industries. They're becoming a lot more popular. And what's also becoming clear is that it's important, as Julie said, it's important to bring people together for an explicit purpose, whether that's collaboration or innovation or just for socializing to get to know each other better. And could you go to the next slide, please, Michaela? I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of what companies are currently doing, because what people want most of all is autonomy. They want the ability to make their own decisions about when they work and where they work. And companies are responding. So if we look at American Express, it has a new policy called the flex model. Whether it doesn't matter if you work fully on-site, fully virtual, or in a hybrid mode, as long as you work this out with your manager, you can work up to 4 calendar weeks per year from someplace other than your primary work site. All right. At PepsiCo, they've taken it even a step further. The office is no longer the primary location for where work gets done. The number of days that people have to be in the office, or a limit on how many days they can work remotely around the globe. This is global in its scope. As long as employees work it out with their managers on which days they're going to be in the office and which days they'll be in remote mode, that's fine, according to the company. So here we have 2 leading companies in terms of trying to respond to these survey data that we've seen, and they have a lot of internal data as well about what people want. So I'll stop there, and I know we'll build on these ideas.
Yeah, the one thing that I would add there, Wayne, is I completely agree with everything you just said. And I think if I had to put it in a nutshell, it would just be that there is no one size fits all. And I think that's the biggest thing to remember, is that every single company is grappling with how this fits to them. And you use the word autonomy a lot. I totally believe in that. And it is a real challenge right now to, like I said, give the organization predictability of how people are going to use their space, but also continue to allow employees autonomy with how they are going to engage with the physical space or not. And there are examples on both ends of the spectrum, companies that have been very bullish towards office first, we expect you to be in, and that's not sitting well with employees. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are companies that have said that they're going virtual first all the way, and that isn't sitting well with employees. So I think what we know is that the answer falls in the middle, and organizations are making their decisions today based on a framework of who their employees are, what they desire, what types of work they do, and really baking that all together so that they understand strategically who they are as a company and what they want their future of work to look like. And then from the bottom up, allowing employees as individuals and certainly teams to decide how they work in that strategic framework together. So I think that it's a real interesting situation right now. There is a lot of complexity to it, but organizations individually are working their way through those questions right now.
Yeah.
Yes, and if I may add an example, so this is great data. So Chase has announced a few weeks ago that we are actually asking all of our employees to go back to the office 3 days a week. And all the top 1,000 senior leaders at JP Morgan to go back 5 days a week to the office. The cultural element associated with that is naturally we have a retail branch organization whose employees have been in the office every day since the start of the pandemic, and there is a notion that the entire organization needs to participate to the effort. There's also the notion naturally that we strongly believe that in-person collaboration, mentorship is important, and apprenticeship is very important as well. I want to tag on to what you said, Julie, if I may, which is when you think of how you do that and when the data you presented is, how do you manage something when your workers don't really want to do it? And that's really what is your new challenge. And you tend to have a distribution. That is, you will have a distribution of 30% of people that actually will do it naturally, 30% of people that will need to be a little bit more encouraged to do it, and maybe 30% of people will choose to look for another role or resist tremendously. And so the change management associated with the return. So as an organization, you have two choices. First is, which model do I adopt, Julie and Wen, as you described, that fits the best the desires of my organization. And then once I have adopted that model, how do I make it work, depending on where on the spectrum you are of giving your employees what they want immediately or not. One interesting piece, and I apologize, I don't have the data with me, but we have seen a lot of data where actually senior leaders have a very different view of the need to return to the office than the employees. So what you tend to see is senior leaders will overwhelmingly say that office presence is very important. Well, naturally, and when the data that you just showed was absolutely correct and accurate, which is the vast majority of our employees, and the employees say, I would like to have flexibility, the opportunity to work from home. And you see it, they vote with their feet. That is, when you give them the choice, like we just did during the Omicron wave, the vast majority of people stay at home. Even though, by the way, if you look at Apple data or credit card data, in their regular life, people have go back in person in all the activities, restaurants, venues, et cetera, et cetera. So it has, what is the shift that we need to really understand is, this is no longer a decision as it relates to COVID. It is a decision as it relates to work-life balance, personal choices, and lifestyle that people have chosen or adopted over the last 2 years. And how do you re-engage them in that conversation is really an essential part of the discussion. And if I may add, I'd like to tag along to also what you said on, therefore, how do you make the office presence meaningful? And this is a little bit back to my earlier argument. Before, the symbiosis was happening naturally because this is what everybody did. And so you could rely on the fact that since it's what everybody did, that it would happen. Now you're not in that situation. What you don't want is someone to come in, sit at their desk and be on Zoom all day, because it leads them to question the meaning of life, right? So it's therefore much more important now to say, how do I make sure that when someone makes the effort, the commute, the time, the money, by the way, people realize it costs money, gas money, lunch money, etc., to actually attend an office location. How do I make sure that that effort and experience first is recognized, and second is meaningful? Oh, today I did something that actually meant so why is JP Morgan asking senior leaders to be there 5 days a week? Because when we want employees to meet their managers when they are in the office, and at the very least have the opportunity and the recognition to say, I actually had some exposure today. It was important to me. The reason I was there gave me that opportunity. I have a good reason. And it's how do you create all those small or large moments that then help encourage folks into the new norm that you as a leader of your organization, you wish to set.
And Laurent, just building on that, senior leaders in every organization have to sit back and decide, how are we going to get the work done? We have work to execute. What's the best way to make this happen? And I know in banking, you've got retail branches, you have face-to-face requirements with customers. You don't really have a choice. What makes it particularly difficult for senior management teams is that in this great resignation that we're seeing and the tight labor markets, workers have more bargaining power than they've ever had before. So I think the result of this is that organizations are kind of co-creating the future of work, listening to workers, but at the same time, they have to think, senior executives have to think, how do we get the work done? We satisfy our customers.
Absolutely. And we are seeing a great disparity by job type. So very interesting.
Yeah.
So by job type, and then by, if I may say, by character profile, and I'll explain. We have job types that are naturally extremely linked to human interactions, sales, customer service, activities where actually performing your role relies on you having a human interaction with another person. You will see that those people tend also to be more extrovert. And that population wants to be a significant portion of the time in a interaction mode. But you see as well that naturally other job types may be more like mine, financial, analytics, technology, where your success is reliant more on you working on a machine, frankly.
Yeah.
Those people are expressing a lot less interest in being in an office environment and a lot more interest in remaining remote. Lastly, I want to highlight something that has come very keen to us is you need to be very careful also with certain populations where actually the commute, the office presence is a bigger burden on them. I'll give you a couple of examples. Single women or single parents who raise children. And we still know, schools can send your kids back home on a moment's notice. How do you have that flexibility? Some population who live in areas where public transportation is less available or commuting is not as easy. How do you create that flexibility? So this new world is forcing us to think about a number of elements that did not come to mind, I would say, at least to my mind, prior to the pandemic, and is forcing us to rethink all of those and to be very open and listening to our employees and their needs and to create the flexibility. But it's a much more custom-made flexibility than it used to be, because we need to recognize people's individual circumstances.
So general question for the group. If we think about management practices and culture and so forth, and I'm thinking particularly of a couple different aspects, and wondering how we approach those in this more hybrid world. One is, hiring and onboarding new talent. And then the other is performance management. When maybe people aren't in the office, whatever, once every 2 weeks or 3 days a week, or they're not there all the time. Some of these things that traditionally were much more, they were all in person.
Yeah, so I mean, the way that I would answer those questions is look at how effective those things were before the pandemic also, right? Hiring and onboarding talent, performance management, they weren't necessarily things that were running on all cylinders before the pandemic. And I think that this is an opportunity to say, let's figure out how to do this right. And from a onboarding and hiring perspective, I think that there are a lot of companies that learned a lot of lessons because again, job growth has still been very prevalent throughout this pandemic. So you have case studies of companies that have hired thousands and thousands of people. And recently, I don't know if you saw Salesforce has, I think it's being called Trailblazer Ranch that they are creating, which is basically going to be like a campus retreat for people to come to actually really get immersed in that culture, especially during the hiring and onboarding phase. So it's a real, progressive way at looking at things. But I think the idea is that you don't necessarily just have to be at a physical presence 5 days a week to get hired and onboarded correctly. I think there's a lot of touch points, big and small moments that you can create both virtually and physically throughout that process to make it very successful, drawing on the lessons that we've learned. Performance management is one, and I noticed that there was a note in the chat about productivity even, and to me, this goes hand in hand. Productivity is the holy grail of trying to measure what makes one person productive over another, or how you even measure what productivity means for one person over another. And I think that the lessons that we've learned throughout the pandemic can also greatly be applied here, because we really need to put training and change management, as Lawrence said, in the hands of the managers so that they understand how to set goals, follow up on those goals on a much more frequent time basis than they maybe have in the past, which has been that mid-year point and that year-end point, but make it more of a constant feedback loop, which really was something that employees were striving and yearning for even before the pandemic. And I think that if you create that, now you're creating a more engaged workforce, which is better. So now you have a workforce that has a more continuous feedback loop with their employer, who has more autonomy over how they work, who has clear goals, who is turning into a more engaged worker, which we know was a major problem before the pandemic. That yes, maybe you could count heads when you walked out of your office, but that didn't necessarily equate to productivity. And we know that didn't equate to an engaged workforce, because one of the most common narratives out there was how disengaged the workforce is and how we needed to do something to change that. So I actually think this is all a very positive if we use the tools that we've learned to really strengthen the foundation that our employees are operating off of.
Yeah, Laurent, could you talk about building on what Julie said about so many firms have hired large numbers of workers in this pandemic environment, and I know Chase has done exactly that. How do you preserve the company culture? Whoops.
Mute.
Yeah, mute.
Here is the sentence that was pronounced the most in the last 2 years. Yeah, you're on mute. But thank you, Wayne, for that. I think so. Amazing that thousands and thousands of people have joined firms, have never met anyone in person to this point. One, it's working. I mean, so we have to recognize that. Interestingly as well, I think, and I see a few questions around the Great Resignation. Zoom has lowered the barrier to exit. I think one of the things we may want to think about is, prior to Zoom, you would go to an office, you had friends, you had colleagues, you had people you cared about. So it's not the building, it's actually the community you were part of. And I think in considering another role or different thing, you were thinking about losing that community. I think Zoom has created a distance that have lowered that barrier. That is, the only difference between your old job and your new job is you change the Zoom number that you dial in on Monday versus what you were dialing in on Friday. So one of the very important notion for us is to how to recreate that community. The same thing around welcoming people. And I think it's what Julie said as well, is it's all those ceremonies and those little things that, whether it's about productivity, performance, getting to know someone, welcoming them and integrating them into your organization, is to no longer believe that it just happens. You have to take actual measured and repeated actions that ensure that what you want communicated, whether it's goals, objectives, it's norm. So cultures for me are norms of behaviors, how you deal with a colleague, how you deal with a customer, how what is the most important values in your firms, how do you deal with conflict, resolve problems. All those elements that you think are now become part of the norms of behaviors in your culture of your organization, you have to be very explicit about it. And so a lot of what we have done is actually we had to reinforce formal training for our new employees to make sure that we inject all those norms of behaviors in a very thoughtful fashion. So going to answer directly your question is, and to say, those things I need to let you know, and you need to acknowledge that you've heard them, that these are the behaviors that you are going to engaging, and being much more purposeful, but also much more intense and frequent in your communication. Again, like Julie said, whether it's feedback, it's goals, or it's here is what's important to me, or this worked, but this didn't work, and I need to let you know right now, not wait 3 months or 6 months to say, remember, you did this 6 months ago and it was not great. No, and so it's actually all the best practices of management that we keep on learning. We really have to practice them. And before, you may have thought that it was optional. It is no longer optional. And it's also a fantastic opportunity. This transitional phase back to a new normal is a fantastic opportunity to engage in those conversations. And to do it, and to think about it, and to design it. And so I really embrace that. That is this notion that we now have a fresh set of eyes on everything that we're doing, and we have the opportunity to rebuild it better, because your point was amazingly important. Before, we took it as granted and we had a disengaged workforce simply because I could count head. We don't want that. We have the opportunity to build it.
Yeah, I love what you're saying, Lauren. And, I think that it's important to note that we did have a disengaged workforce, and we have the opportunity, as you said, to make change. And so I always say it would be a shame to waste this pandemic, right? Because it's going to be easy to kind of revert back to that old normal. And we have a chance right now, I lost my thought there, but we have a chance right now to build loyalty, right? And loyalty is something that, especially with this great resignation or the great renegotiation or whatever we want to call it, is something that people don't have a lot of. In building not only those norms of the culture of your organization, but also getting to know people more deeply on a personal level and making them feel heard really helps to build that loyalty. And one of the most extreme cases that I saw, and it inspired me, and I know this is hard to do on a grand scale, but a woman that I know posted on LinkedIn about her onboarding experience at a company. And this company went above and beyond during a remote time to engage her family in the onboarding. So they sent each of her family members a little something that sort of like was indicative of the company, whether it be her child or her husband or herself. Also had team building exercises that, they engaged with for fun. And then also had, moments in the office where they came together to really set the stage of what the future of work was going to be for that person in that organization. And even when it came to accepting the offer, the entire management team was on the phone with her when she accepted, or was offered that particular role in the company, which all of those little things created a sort of form of loyalty that was building within her, that then she posted, made that company really look good on LinkedIn, and really set the stage for the future of her role in that company. And it was just very inspiring to me, because it really made tangible this idea that those moments we could either waste and not engage properly with our employees, or we could really make it so that they were game changers and they did a lot of good in a very short amount of time, and for probably very little effort also. So I think I really take to heart everything that you're saying about those moments that we can build.
Julie, at a broader level, anybody who's starting a new job really has two questions in the back of their head. The first one is, am I going to be safe? And the second one is, am I going to be accepted? And you've just been describing, and Laurent's been describing, is ways of making people feel accepted and welcome, and giving them the tools to be able to do their jobs effectively. And that is going to lead to what you've called loyalty, Yeah, absolutely. So I'm with you 100%.
And I'm seeing one of the questions, it's really around a designed employee experience, including in the office. I see a very interesting question around office sharing and physical space. And Julie, I'm sure you have lots of insight on that. Is when you think of your employee experience, so whether it's feeling welcome, being informed, being part of the family, have the cultural element, it's also, and we get a ton of feedback around your physical experience when you make the effort to come to the office. And because companies make there is a associated, what Julie described before, associated set of decision, which is companies are also contracting their real estate or rethinking on how they're using it by saying, if people are not here all the time, the logical thing is we need to share the space. Mm-hmm. And you have mixed reviews of that. That is, you have some folks that are comfortable with it, others that are not, simply because they want the space to be clean. They don't like the fact it was used by someone else. They have their favorite seat.
Yeah.
And it's not something that to be dismissed or say, they're just, it is an important part of their experience. I don't have all the answers on that. All I know right now is that this is, a lot of what we're talking about has a huge emotional component, meeting people, being there, etc. And take that into consideration, and to say, as part of that is, what are the norms of behavior that we want when people are actually in the office? I'll give you one example. I am back. I saw someone I hadn't seen in a while. I went to reintroduce myself and extended my hand to shake that person's hand. She went, wow. It came from all my best intentions, but I made the person uncomfortable, which is naturally the last thing I want to do, especially as we want to encourage people to be back in an office environment. So, but it's a new norm, right? It's something that we never thought about. I didn't think about. And it's part of that. So people's notion of safe space and people's notion of social distance and people's have changed. And we created the situation where we are creating paradoxes where we want people together, but that togetherness needs to be different. And it's all a learning session where I think, and the only answer I have for that is continued dialogue and listening. And then you land as a team to a place where everybody gets comfortable with that norm. But it has to be discussed and designed, not just assumed.
That's the co-creation. That's co-creating the future. Yeah, what you're just describing. Beautiful example.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, before the pandemic, for years, CBRE was unveiling what we call our CBRE 360 environments, which are much more collaborative in nature. They favor we space over me space, and we have over a decade of experience of creating these. But what was created 10 years ago versus, what has been most recently created are obviously very different, because every single one you learn from and you iterate off of. But the baseline of what they have all done since the beginning is include the people that are going to be using that space in the decision-making process of what that space is going to look like and how it's going to be designed. And I think that that's a really important element going forward that has to happen for all companies. And what we see is that there's a lot of design happening on paper right now, thinking about what the future might be. But to your point, Laura, until people are in and they realize how they're going to interact with each other, you can't make these big sweeping changes unless your hand is forced because of a relocation or something like that. Many are just sitting back and saying, we're going to hold off on the big capital projects until we really know how people are going to engage together. But back to your equity of experience, point, we do have to make incremental changes in the office to make sure that people have equitable experiences when they're engaging between the physical and the digital worlds. And that's a big thing right now. Video conferencing, ensuring that the right etiquette is in place. Now that can be something as simple as if you're in an in-person meeting and there's one person on the other end, that everybody has their laptop in front of them so that you still get this experience online, or putting in really advanced, technology where that camera is kind of following the person that's talking around the office and zoning in on them and making the audio experience equitable. So there's a lot of really interesting things happening from a design perspective right now, both incremental in the moment and, thinking towards long-term sweeping change, which co-creation is a really big part of that.
If I could, we're winding down here. There are several questions in here about how hybrid work has impacted productivity. And I've read everything from, it's productivity's way up to, productivity's down, which I suspect has to do with industries and functions and that kind of thing. But any insights on productivity?
Well, I can just say, what the research says on this. The research has shown for years that teleworkers' productivity did not go down when they started teleworking. But I think you make a really good point, Scott, that much of this probably varies by industry and by type of job, because there are some jobs that lend themselves, as Laurent said, if you're doing financial analysis or certainly back office work, it really doesn't matter where you do it. You can be just as productive at home or in a remote location. But for other types of work, it's really critical that people do have this face-to-face interaction, and being remote doesn't make them necessarily more productive.
I think you have a broader notion, which is, so first you have jobs that are highly measurable, jobs that are not. So that's, but it's productivity tends to be a fairly short-term measure. And I think the question around your design, and as Julie and Wayne were saying, we are at the moment making long-term decisions. And so a productivity in the short term, so depending on jobs went up, went down, et cetera, et cetera. The real question is, am I creating a place that is going to be successful for the next 10 years with the design that I have? And how will I know? And I don't, unfortunately, I don't have, if I had an answer, and so it's think of your productivity, but it's think about what is important for you that you want to deliver in 3 years, 5 years from now, and how is this work environment allow you to do that 3 years, 5 years from now, and or how will it affect it? And it means that you may think of measuring things that are not just the immediate productivity. And it's true of innovation, it's true of a number of, so it is I think the big question for the next few years, how we will make that happen.
Yeah. And, from my perspective, productivity, I go back to the engagement discussion. I truly believe that engagement and productivity are linked, and the more engaged workforce that you have, the more productive they're going to be. I think that over the short term, throughout the pandemic, the health of companies has obviously been good, right? There has not been a huge blip on the radar of any of these companies, especially tech companies, which you could assume that means that the productivity of their employees has been good. I think the question comes down to the innovation, right? And I think that's hard to measure, and that's going to take time to show its way out. Has innovation been as great during this time? And is that going to cause a problem, over the next couple of years if it hasn't been? And I think the jury is still out on that. So that's my view on productivity.
Yeah, the other thing that's related to that is that Laurent spoke about the pandemic actually providing an opportunity to put what we've known to be good management practices in place. And one of the things that we've really seen in terms of a shift is a focus more on results than on time spent in the office. It's not face time that's important anymore. It's what you deliver. And to Laurent's point about, you got to look forward 3 to 5 years from now. How are you going to be able to deliver those results? And that, to me, is the ongoing challenge as this hybrid environment evolves over time, is how do we ensure that we can deliver results over the long term based on these new working arrangements?
Well, we are almost out of time. I want to thank our panelists for a tremendously stimulating conversation today. As we all grapple with this grand experiment, which shows no sign of slowing down or resettling at this moment in time. So, audience, I hope you were able to gain some good insights today from our panelists. And I want to alert you to our last 2 upcoming Business Insights, one on strategies for onboarding and retaining diverse talent, another real challenge that companies face, and then some of the new frontiers in artificial intelligence. We have just really great panels for both of those. So I hope you'll join us for those. Again, thank you for joining us, and thanks to our panelists for a wonderful morning.
Thank you.
Y'all take good care.
Okay, thank you.